to start off again. Start off here with raising kids, a 2-week one on raising kids. So, any thoughts on the song that's coming up here? Any ideas? Tony had a thought. What did you think? The Cat Stevens, "Cat in the Cradle." That's a really good one. I didn't do that one though. Have any other guesses? Next week. There you go. All right, go ahead and play it, Tony. Probably will know this one.
Who are on the road?
Did you?
Must have a code that you can live
Who
by.
sings this one?
And so
Yeah, Crosby, Stills, and
become
Nash.
yourself.
Okay. Does he? And the name of it? Yeah, Teach Your Children. Teach Your Children by Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Just a piece of trivia. The band was originally Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Whipple, but Tony decided to forsake rock and roll for a life at University of Minnesota. So he gave his position up to Neil Young. So anyway, Crosby, Stills, and Nash, Teach Your Children. Raising kids is not an easy task. You know, it's not an easy thing to do. Think of it from the other direction, from God raising us. Is that an easy task? I doubt it. You look at his relationship that he has, especially with Israel in the Old Testament, and he constantly is referencing him raising them or birthing them, and the ins and the outs and the ups and the downs that he has with Israel. So raising kids, whether it's God raising us or us raising actual biological children, it's not easy. But the Bible gives us very good advice, very good instructions on some things that we can do to raise kids and to raise them well. That doesn't necessarily guarantee they're going to turn out well, but we can do our job properly as parents to raise them well. So again, if you don't have kids, I think this is still going to be relevant because it says just as much to us about God and how God looks at us and treats us as it does about how we raise, per se, our own children, our own kids. Also, too, it goes to raising kids within the church. So there's always kids here within the church, so we raise them together as a church. So we can get that in a couple different ways. So let's go ahead and start in Genesis. That's where we're really going to park ourselves this morning. First book of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1. So what in the world does Genesis chapter 1 have to do with raising kids? Well, we'll look at here. Look at this here. We're going to look at the creation story. The creation story. We're going to see here that in everything God does in the creation, He sets boundaries. God sets boundaries, all right? 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the water. So we've got creation, but everything's kind of messy. Nothing is quite as it should be. So God begins to set boundaries. Verse 3, let there be light, and there was light. So what happens? God saw that light was good, and He separated the light from the darkness. We have the boundaries being set between light and darkness. If you keep moving down, verse 6, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let separate waters from waters. So He separates the waters in the heavens from the waters below. Again, a boundary set. Verse 9, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. So God sets boundaries between ocean and dry land. In verse 11, He begins to set boundaries for plants and vegetation. Verse 12, the earth brought forth vegetation. What happens? Plants yield their seed according to their own kind. So each plant and each vegetable or whatever has its own boundary. It does what it's supposed to do. So God begins then to set boundaries on time in verse 14 and following. Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens and separate the day from the night. So there's boundaries put on seasons for days and for years, and time is set. Boundaries are put on time as well here. And then God, after God properly orders or sets boundaries upon creation itself, then He moves on to boundaries for humanity. So God creates humanity. In verse 28, He sets boundaries upon them. He gives them instructions. Verse 28, God blessed them, and He said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, and have dominion over the fish and over the birds and over the heavens. Verse 29, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in it. This is what you're going to have for food, all right? So he says, all right, here's what you eat. You eat the plants. The corollary of that is you don't eat the animals. That doesn't happen right now. That happens later. But he gives them instructions on what to eat. We can skip over to chapter 2, verse 15. He gives them more boundaries and instructions. The Lord took the man and put him in the garden to work and keep it. And the Lord God commanded him, saying, you may surely eat of every tree in the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in that day you eat of it, you shall surely die. So he says what you can eat, what you can't eat, what they are to do. So God sets boundaries for both creation and for humanity. The whole creation story really is structured around God establishing and setting boundaries for both creation and for humanity. So why does God set boundaries? When you think as parents, or as kids, as our parents setting boundaries on us, or as us setting boundaries on our kids, we often think, well, our parents like to do that, or our kids think they like to do that because they're mean, or they're self-centered. They don't want us doing those type of things. But why do we set boundaries? And the boundaries are rooted in love. Okay? God roots his boundaries in love. In 1 John 4, John tells us that God is what? Do you remember? God is love. If he's nothing else, God is love, all right? So God roots his boundaries in love. So how do boundaries relate to God's love? Let's look at that. How do boundaries themselves relate to God's love? Well, boundaries are set for our protection. They are put there for our protection, especially when we cooperate with them, all right? Look at the boundaries set with the tree here in Genesis 2, verses 17. What are the boundaries set there? How is that for their protection? What happens if they eat of the tree of knowledge and good and evil? They're going to die. So why then does God tell them not to eat of it? Yeah, for their own good. It's to protect them. Does God want them to die? No. He wants them to be safe. He wants to protect them. He loves them. So not eating of the tree is for their own protection. Okay, so we tell our kids, don't run out in the street. Look both ways before crossing the street. Now, is it to spoil their fun in running across the street? No. Why do we tell our kids to look both ways before crossing the street? What? Yeah, so they don't get hit by a car, right? Look both ways so you don't get hit by a car. It's not because we're mean or because we don't like our kids or we don't want them to have fun, but it's for their own protection. We don't want them to get hit by the car. The same thing is going on here. God set boundaries upon us because he loves us for our own protection, and we do the same or should do the same for our kids. See, boundaries in life are designed to keep the good in and keep the bad out. Right? That's what's happening here in the garden, or what was supposed to happen in the garden. It was supposed to keep the garden, Adam and what he was doing was to keep the good in, to keep life in the garden, to stay there, to worship God, that life would be fulfilled. That was the good that they were to have. What was the bad that they were to keep out? It's going to be the serpent. They were to watch that, keep that out, keep the good in. So boundaries that God gives us are for a purpose. They're to protect us. They're to keep the good in and the bad out. The same is, again, for our kids. What do we want our kids to do? We want our kids to keep in their hearts and keep in their lives everything that is good, don't we? But we want them to reject that which is bad, don't we? So boundaries build walls or protection around them that to keep the good in and keep the bad out. God has really shown us the way here in this creation story, shown us the way of setting boundaries, of establishing the boundaries, the importance of establishing boundaries, because he loves us, because He wants us to keep the good in our lives and keep the bad outside of them. And he's encouraging us then to pass them down to our kids as well. You know, we are a people who live with boundaries, aren't we? Whether we like it or not, we have to have boundaries, right? You know, if you work with kids, if you've ever worked with kids, kids say they don't like rules, right? They like to have anarchy and run rule-less. But when you get right down to it, kids need structure. They need boundaries in order to flourish and to function. There's lots of shows out there about kind of, it's really popular nowadays, the kind of the post-apocalyptic, end of the world show, whether it's like with zombies or whether it's with, what are some of the other things that happen? Nuclear. Anybody watch like The Walking Dead? Anybody watch that? so Alex watches The Walking Dead. Nobody, or at least nobody else is going to admit that they watch The Walking Dead, right? But what in The Walking Dead or any of these other things that happen, these post-apocalyptic movies or TV shows, humanity is scattered, and when they come together, what do you think is the first thing they tend to do when they come together in a group? Well, they make rules. They establish some sort of government or hierarchy to keep order. They establish rules. They quickly find out, that's part of the show, is they quickly find out that people left without rules doesn't work. Boundaries have to be established, whether it's actual physical boundaries or whether it's kind of unwritten boundaries and laws that here's what you do, here's what you don't do, here are the consequences, here are not the consequences. But we say we don't like rules, we say we don't like boundaries, but deep down they keep us safe. They keep us protected. They let us know what's right and they let us know what's wrong. We're really a people who don't function well, who really can't function without them. And I think that's established all the way back to the creation story. We've got to have boundaries to function well, and God establishes that for us. You know, the point is that we've got a God, got a Father who relates to us as a father relates to his children. He is the Father and we are his children. He has paved the way for us. This is how a parent is to relate to his or her child, or this is how it's to function, and God sets that for us. These are how parents are to function with their children. How? By establishing boundaries out of love for their protection, to keep in the good in their lives and to keep out the bad. So let's look at a couple practical applications of this, or delve into this a little bit further. This one of the first things I'm going to say here is kids who never have boundaries established for them as children grow up to be adults without boundaries. Kids who never learn to operate with boundaries grow up to be adults without boundaries. How many of you have experienced that firsthand? Whether it's, well, somebody wanted bits that, yeah, that's me. But has seen that happen. That as a kid, the person never had boundaries, and now as an adult, the person still doesn't have boundaries. How many have seen that happen at one time or other? I have. If they didn't have boundaries established as a child, they are not going to have boundaries as an adult. See, why is that? They never learn, a kid never learns, or a child never learns to set boundaries, to have boundaries established upon them, but never learns to set boundaries upon themselves. And that's just how they grow up. No, I don't have boundaries. I don't know how to keep out the bad out of my life, and I don't know how to keep in the good. You know, there's a book out there, actually Linda recommended it, Boundaries. Has anybody read that book, Boundaries? And Danny gave it to me, by Townsend and McLeod. Yeah. And it's a good book just about establishing boundaries. And people who get their boundaries all screwed up, they say, go the opposite. Boundaries are designed to keep in the good and keep out the bad. People who don't understand or have never had boundaries, it works the opposite. They keep in the bad and keep out the good. They tend to keep the bad things in their life centered around those things, and they can't let good people into their lives. They can't let good things into their lives, and they keep the bad things centered there. See, what happens what happens with people who learn boundaries, or people who learn boundaries and kids who learn boundaries early on, is they learn the natural consequences for their actions. That's part of what boundaries are. They set up the natural flow of things. And that's essentially what God does back in creation. If you look in Genesis chapter 3 is what we call the fall. That's where Adam and Eve sin. They get cast out of the garden. What did God establish as a natural consequence for breaking this boundary? What was the consequence we just said for 2:17, this boundary that God sets? What's the consequence of the boundary for breaking that boundary? They're going to die. So what happens in chapter 3? They get kicked out of the garden, and they do experience both spiritual death, and they're going to experience physical death. God lets them reap the consequences of their violation of the boundaries. And that's part of what we as parents are to do. We allow our kids to experience the natural consequences of violating boundaries that both we have set for them and that society has set in general. Now, what does that look like? What might that look like? Well, for someone like Fiona's age, what would be a natural consequence for her? Well, Fiona loves dessert. She loves snacks. You know, she's a 5-year-old, I guess. But one of the things she always looks forward to is dessert. Now, she loves cookies and things of that sort. So natural consequence is that if you don't eat your dinner, if you don't eat your vegetables, you don't get dessert. You know, so we can set very small, easy boundaries for little kids. If you don't clean your room, what's the consequence of not cleaning your room? You know, whatever. You can't go outside and play, or you can't have the neighbor kid up to play with. You know, whatever. We can establish natural boundaries for kids. Now, that gets a little bit more difficult as children get older, doesn't it? You know, as teenagers, what are boundaries for that? You know, if you violate so your boundaries is no alcohol drinking as a teenager, or whatever that is. Well, what's your consequence for that? Well, maybe you lose the car. You lose your driving privilege. Or, you know, if you flunking out of your classes, what's your consequence for that? You lose your what's that? Sports or phone or computer, whatever. But we establish that natural development of consequences for our actions, okay? Now, sometimes we can intervene on that. And God does that for us, doesn't He? God intervenes for us sometimes and lets us not experience the consequences for our actions. On the other hand, He does that. We don't experience the spiritual consequence for our actions, do we? Not if we come to know Him and are forgiven by Him. We don't experience the spiritual consequences for our actions. But you know what? Doesn't He often let us experience the physical consequences of our actions, even if we repent of those? An example, all right, if I'm a Christian and I commit adultery and I end up with an STD, and I ask for God's forgiveness, is God going to forgive me of that? Sure. Is God going to cure me of my STD? Hope this isn't being recorded, so it doesn't look very good. You're going to have Brad edited this part out. Of course, he could edit it any way he wanted, too. So, is God going to heal me of that? I doubt it. He's going to let me reap the natural consequences of my action. You can put anything in there that God oftentimes lets us reap the consequences of our actions. And we get out of whack when we don't let our kids, or don't let whomever, whether they're adult kids or little kids, reap often the consequences of their actions. Now, why is that? Why do we have to let them reap the consequences of their actions? Basically, getting back to what we said before, kids who don't learn the consequences for their actions, or never learn boundaries, never learn them if they're not taught them. You don't learn them on the fly oftentimes. You don't learn them by maturing out of it. You really only learn boundaries when they are placed upon you by someone else. 95% of the time, someone doesn't just wake up one day and say, it's time to grow up. It's time to start adhering to boundaries. Now, sometimes that happens, but it's rare. It's rare. most of the time people have to be forced to respect and to understand boundaries. That happens with kids all the time. Kids who never learn the consequences for their actions or never learn boundaries keep pressing the envelope, don't they? They never understand that, whoa, if I spend all the money that I have before the end of the month, I may not have enough money to buy groceries at the end of the month. Or if I don't learn how to manage the money that I have, I'm never going to, it's going to spiral. It's going to get worse. And we all know, those of you who have far more experience than I do, I've got the wise old parent with good old 5 years experience, so it's not like I've got tons of experience here, but it gets worse as they get older, doesn't it? If they're having boundary problems at 3, it's going to get worse at 6. If they're having boundary problems at 6, it's going to get worse when they're 16. If they're having boundary problems at 16, it's going to get worse when they're 26. And if they're having boundary problems at 26, it's going to get worse when they're 36. It's not going to get better unless someone, whether that's the parent, even a parent of an adult child, or a parent of a younger child, helps them set boundaries, helps them realize the consequences for their actions. Now, is this going to be pleasant for them, for your children, to set boundaries upon them? Is it going to be pleasant for them? Is it going to be pleasant for you? No, it's not fun for either party. It's not fun for parents to set boundaries on kids, and it's not fun for the kids to have boundaries set upon them. And again, it gets worse as they get older. If it's hard for a 5-year-old to have boundaries set upon them, it's even harder for a 15-year-old who's never had boundaries to have boundaries set upon them. It's even worse for a 30-year-old who's never had boundaries to have boundaries set upon them. But again, they're never going to mature into the people they need to be until someone takes the responsibility and sets boundaries upon them. It's painful. You think God wanted to expel Adam and Eve from the garden? Do you think he wanted to do those things? I don't think he did. He loved them. But he loved them enough to say, here are the consequences for your actions. Here are the consequences for breaking your boundaries. Because he wanted them to mature into the people that they needed to be. We, hopefully, as parents, want our kids to mature into the people they want to be. And to do that, we have to help them to learn to operate within boundaries, okay? The natural consequence for our action are built into the foundation of creation. What? The wages for what we do, the wages of sin is death. That's part of what God created. Well, he didn't create sin, or didn't create people to die per se, but that's what happens. Those are the natural consequences of our actions. So, but we can't go overboard. We can be lax and set no boundaries for our kids and have kids rule everything. I was in the grocery store the other day, and these parents, a couple of parents came in with like 2 or 3 kids, and it was very clear, even after about 45 seconds, who was running the grocery shopping. It was the kids. Every 10 seconds, you would hear a child's name called out by the parent. Like every 10 seconds. And they were weird names too, so I can't remember what they were. But every few seconds, the parents were hollering at the kids, put that down, don't touch that, get back here, leave that alone, keep your hands off your brother, keep your hands off your sister, don't break that. It was very clear that there were no boundaries at all being set by the parents on the children. And I guarantee you, at 15, those kids are going to be 10 times worse than they are now if the parents don't take the step now to set boundaries on the children. So we can be way too lax. On the other hand, we as setting boundaries as parents can be way too strict as well. There is a balance to be had here. Notice when God created boundaries in Genesis 2, he simply said, see that tree over there? Don't eat of that tree. You can do anything else you want. You can eat anything else you want. Just don't eat from that one tree. God didn't say, okay, see the banana, here's how you peel it, and here's how you eat it. The coconut, you need to, cut it up this way. And the carrot, you need to eat from the pointy end first. And you need to prepare your food this way. God didn't say that, did he? He simply said, figure it out. Eat whatever you want. Cook it whatever you want, whatever. Just don't eat from that tree, okay? So God set boundaries, but he didn't micromanage the situation. I think we can learn from that as parents too. Set boundaries from your kids, but give them decisions to make. For example, for Fiona, maybe that's why we have kids, that I can use them in sermon. Although I have to cut back on that when she's old enough to realize what I am doing. But for instance, for Fiona, we say, what vegetable would you like with dinner? She can choose what vegetable she wants with dinner. Notice we don't say, do you want a vegetable with dinner? Because I know what that response is going to be. It's going to be no. But what one? Which vegetable do you want? We can give them freedom of choice within a larger frame of boundaries. Okay, Fiona, your friend's going to come over at 4 o'clock. You just need to have your room cleaned before 4 o'clock. You know, it's 8 in the morning now. You've got all day. Just get it cleaned before 4 and your friend can come over. You've got a choice when you want to do it. It just needs to be done. You know, we can give our kids freedom, and we need to do that. That's important. Give them ability to say yes and no. Give them the ability to make decisions for themselves. Because if we overmanage, if we micromanage, the kids are going to grow up to not being able to put their foot down and not being able to make a decision for themselves. And we've probably seen this. You know, how many of you know the kid whose parents micromanaged everything in their life? Every person they hung out with, everywhere they went, every dime they spent, every piece of clothing they wore was micromanaged by the parent. And when the kid got off on his own, the kid went nuts. The kid went overboard. The kid couldn't, whatever route that took, because the kid never had to make a decision for him or herself. So we can't over or micromanage, but we can give them freedom in this. And I think Paul talks about this in Ephesians. Let me throw this one, Galatians, Ephesians. He tells us as parents, children, obey your parents for the Lord. This is right. Honor your father and mother, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. And here it says, fathers, this is what I want to point out. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. I think that's part of what Paul's getting to. Don't set boundaries on your kids so much that it drives them to anger, that you frustrate them, that they can't ever live up to your boundaries. Give them room for freedom, to be kids, to make decisions for themselves, but set the boundaries and set them well. But give them freedom to make choices for their own, all right? So, a couple of two last things here. Setting boundaries for our kids and allowing them freedom helps them to learn to set boundaries for themselves. And we've got to do that. We've kind of already talked about that. But setting boundaries for our kids teaches them to set boundaries for themselves. When to say no, how to keep in the good and keep out the bad. That's part of what boundaries do. And I want to end with this here. Do I? Let me give a preview of next week. Probably the most important boundary that we can ever set for our kids, and which we're going to talk about in detail next week, is spiritual boundaries. It's probably the most important thing we could ever do for our kids. Raising them in the Lord. Giving them the direction. Now, that's no guarantee they're ever going to follow that, but we are called as Christians to at least set them on the right path. They may deviate from it. That's not our responsibility. We're not responsible for what they do, but we're responsible to them to help them set on the right path. We'll talk about that next week, but at least get that in there. So lastly, here's what I want to end with. It's never too late. It's never too late to begin to establish boundaries. God did it with adults. Adam and Eve apparently were adults running around. It's never too late to set boundaries with our kids. If you've never set boundaries and your kid's 6, start today. If you've never set boundaries and your kid is 10, start today. If you've never set boundaries and your kid is 30, start today. You still can do that. You still can begin to set boundaries today. What's acceptable, what's not, what line can be crossed, what can't be crossed, what am I going to do, what am I not going to do. And remember, it's not because we're mean or because we're self-centered. Now our kids will probably accuse us of being that. But the point is to help them mature into the people that they need to be, no matter what age. Again, is it going to be easy? No. Especially the older the kid is, the harder it's going to be. Is it going to be painful for them? Yes. Is it going to be painful for you? Yes. And here's the thing, don't do it alone, or you can't do it alone. I think when you try to set boundaries for kids, especially the older they are, the more and more help you need to do that. So if you're in a place where you need to start setting boundaries, seek help. Whether it's help from the church body, whether it's help from a small group, whether it's help from a counselor, whether it's help from a counseling group. Probably the older your child is, the more support you're going to need for setting boundaries. But it's never too late to set boundaries on your kids and to help them keep in the good and to keep out the bad. To establish what it means to be a person of boundaries and to be raised with boundaries and to be able to make decisions for ourselves. So God's love flows through boundaries. We see that in creation. God's love flows through us with the boundaries that He sets for us. We bear the natural consequences of what we do. God does that for us because He loves us. And He calls us to do that with our kids, to help them be adults and help them to grow. Next week, then, we're going to see, well, how do we set these spiritual boundaries? How do we direct our kids spiritually? Again, that's no guarantee, but what can we do for our kids as far as raising them spiritually? And we'll look at that next week. So why don't you stand this morning? We will pray, and we'll have our benediction. Maybe I'll read the same one last week. Okay. Father, help us come to terms with the boundaries You have set upon us. You've called us to be a people who follow the instructions that You give us, to live within the boundaries You have given us. And You call us to pass those on, both to other Christians and to our own biological children, Lord. And help us do that. Help us do it well. Help us to live within the boundaries You have given us, and help us to do that for our kids as well, Father. May we be a people who glorify and honor You through what we do, the things that we say and the things that we think and the things that we teach and the things that we pass on to kids. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.